clearly?
Yes, yes, you are.
I'm sorry that I could not listen to some of the speeches earlier because of the connectivity issues. Luckily, now that I'm in, the topic that has been given to me is on the issues of indigenous faith. Though it is a very wide global practices under the name of indigenous faith, you see across the continents, whether it is in Africa, Latin America, or in Asia. I would like to confine myself within the discourse in Indian context. But having said that, discussion on the indigenous, the term itself stands out, cannot be exclusively talked and in isolation about India alone, because the term indigenous refers to, as we see in the global context, to those communities who have been living and who have lived long before what you call the migrant populations came and overpowered them over a period of time. And this is all that we know about the Native Americans in America and Canada. You know about this in Latin America experiences before the advent of the Spanish colonizers. And you find a similar experience in Africa. So the term indigenous often is referred to the first settler or those who have lived before what you call the colonial migrant came into those regions. So when you translate this indigenous into the Indian context, particularly two Hindi terms comes in our common vocabulary. One is Adivasi and another is Janajati. Now the point is that the translation itself, and as you know, the translation is not a very what you call stereotypical transposition of meaning, but it also carries several worldviews or what you call a cosmology of its own. Now, the term Adivasi implies to those communities who have lived prior to a community who comes, a migrant community. That is to say that this Adivasis lived before the major communities came into those regions. So this theorizing or this mere translation as of these communities as Adivasi endorses the idea though that the majority community came from somewhere else. And this is a big issue. And perhaps I will also not like to buy this translation of Adivasi with indigenous. The other translation is Janajati, that the people who lived in commune, if I have to use the term, that who are more organic in nature and they live together and assign a sense of belongingness internally generated and less prone to mixing up with other communities you call as indigenous. This is the general understanding. So Janajati might be a better translation I see. But there is another conception on indigenous, which I am referring back to a philosopher in 20th century India called K.C. Bhattacharya. According to him, indigenous refers to those communities who are non-modern and non-Western. It is more than the community. It is about the worldview and the practices and value system associated with the community. So to that extent, the entire Indian philosophical thoughts and worldviews traditionally speaking, could be considered as indigenous, that they are non Western and non modern. It has its local root. But then the problem arises is how do you explain those communities whom the Indian constitution has used the term as tribal? You have a particular category called scheduled tribe under the scheduled uh, of this marginalized community. So, to put all the Indian worldviews and traditions within the indigenous for a larger understanding of the worldviews makes sense, but for the practical purposes, in terms of affirmative actions and so on, it becomes little more problematic. But I would like to go for a wider understanding of this term. Now, when we talk of the indigenous faith, and this will imply even to many of the Hindu traditions as well, when we talk of the indigenous faith, often we talk about this view that these indigenous religions believe that everything in this world has a spirit, that all that we see around in this world, materials world, are all embodiment of a spirit. And this is what the colonialist or those forces of colonialism tried to explain these communities as primitive and less civilized, saying that these people sees spirit in a stone, sees spirit in a tree, sees spirit in a mountain. So these are very, very primitive thought. Only spirit you can think is that of the Holy Spirit or some the divine force which is of a very transcendent nature. So you can see that how the narrative that has been given to the indigenous or the primitive with a particular terminology is called animism came to be used. So those people who believes that there are spirits in nature, every part of the nature has a spirit, are called as animist. And these people had been looked in down to an extent that they are not so well developed in terms of thinking processes, in terms of philosophy, in terms of worldviews. So, keeping that in mind, I would also like to draw your attention that recently few environmentalists, feminists, and you may also call some philosophers. I'm talking of Bert Davis and others who are arguing out that, well, this idea that nature has a spirit should be seen more in terms of nature being looked as persons. So you can see a shift in the vocabulary. And this shift in the vocabulary among these environmentalists or what you call feminists and philosophers are not without a reason. There are certain reasons behind which they have shifted the discourse. Now we know that in 20th century and 21st century, how the development processes across the globe have negatively destroyed the environment and how the environmental status are throughout the globe. So there seems to be a larger interest among the theoreticians to look at nature having certain autonomy. Nature not to be merely consumed, but has certain autonomous status. And there is a long debate in the West how much autonomy you can give to a nature vis-a-vis the humans. So these theoreticians go back to animism, which they have somehow, I'm talking of the European narrative, which somehow they have tried to downgrade This worldview saying that nature, the believer, that nature has spirit embedded. Every part of nature has spirits in plural embedded. So they are animist, they are primitive. From this worldview, over a century, because of their own concerns related to developmental project, the issue of autonomy, issue of sustainability, these discourses emerges, and these discourses have led them to rethink on the idea of animism, and they start arguing that instead of the spirit, the natures or parts of the nature by the animist believe that they are persons. So, personhood is something that is acceptable to the academic world. But the spirit is something perhaps today's academic world are yet to grapple with positively or sympathetically. Now, I want to argue that we don't have to be shy away. We don't have to be following these scholars and see that the idea of spirit embedded in the nature is a far-fetched idea, a deep thinking idea. Now, I would like to submit that the idea of the spirit and the body has always been a discourse throughout the world, in every civilizations, in every philosophical traditions. And we try to see the spirit and the body as binary. Now, instead of the word spirit, if somebody is little apprehensive about, one might start thinking that is there non-bodily aspect in a body? Because body seems to be always freezed, static. But the human body is not freezed and it not static. So there are tangible things which you call as body, and perhaps there are intangible things about this body which we cannot see, which we call Atma in many traditions or spirit in many other traditions. So we keep this open ended, not by giving a definitive definition or description about what spirit is. But if we, for the time being, use the word spirit for that intangible part that we cannot see, yet we intuitively feel that there is something intangible about this body itself. I am a thinking being. I am a feeling being. Sometimes I also intuit. So perhaps this is what we need to really look into. Let me give an
Bhagat,
example.
Professor
Am I
Bhagat,
already through with 10
no,
minutes?
yeah, yeah. In fact, we are crossing a time limit. We have Pujya Swamiji
So
also. I request you, to
I have
kindly
not
wind
even
up.
come to the northeast. But anyway, in 2 minutes' time, I will wind up.
Please, please.
So I will give an example of this indivisibility of the bodily and the non-bodily with a particular illustration from the Ao Naga traditions. Among the Ao Naga traditions, in their creation myth, what you may call cosmology, they say all the owls, this Ao Naga community is one of the communities speaking a different language, and they believe that they all came out of 6 stones, patthar. 6 पत्थरों से ये इंसान जाग उठे हैं. The owls community emerged from 6 stones. Now, naturally, this is a very quote unquote stupid, primitive concept. But if you look at this, the thought itself throws open to our thinking process that perhaps the divide between the animate and the inanimate, the bodily and the spirit, is a very stereotypical division. Further, they say these 6 stones, what they call lung terok, are 3 males and 3 females. And look at this, what you call in the modern terminologies, gendering of the body. gendering of the inanimate. What you would have thrown away as merely body static as inanimate has been brought along with something called life, that is the human, and that stone which you call as inanimate are being gendered as male and the female. Now, I'm not going into the realist interpretation of this, but this is a myth. And myth has to be understood in terms of the purpose that the community believes. And the purpose is, I believe, and I see, is the inseparability of the inanimate from the animate, life from the non life, body from the non body, tangible from the intangible. And if you look closer, perhaps some of the what you call Vedic traditions even talk about this much more in details. And to that extent, if you go a little more philosophically, what K.C. Bhattacharya was talking about, the Indian philosophical traditions, in which I will like to bring the indigenous thought too, are non-Western and has to be given a different discourse altogether and not always seen through the Western methodological paradigms. I'm sorry, I wish I had
Oh,
more time. I
oh yeah,
took too long in methodology, but then this is a problem with professors being asked to
philosophy,
speak for 10 minutes.
professors and philosophy.